thank you very much indeed for hosting us today. It's a great honor being from Bloomberg Television, following on from our founder, and once again looking to New York expertise to a certain degree, helping London grow from an infrastructure point of view. We've just had London Mayor and former New York Mayor, and Isabel, yourself, you're from Helming, from originally coming from New York, but now helping work out how London can become a far more environmentally friendly, but hopefully more sophisticated infrastructure in terms of travel. And give us some phenomenal stats to start it off. Give us a sense of how fast London is growing, much faster than you'd really anticipated in terms of the city and the population.
Yeah, I think in terms of growth, actually, there are a lot of people here who wouldn't consider our level of growth to be that extraordinary. But London just hit its highest ever population in February. But when you look outside, it's a low-density city. So for us, that's a big shock. We're growing around twice the rate that we previously thought we were going to grow. We're looking to get up to about 10 million people. That's what the forecasts are saying. We've currently got about 8 million. So for a lot of cities around the world, that isn't, that substantial. But for us, not being a growth city, actually London went through 30 or 40 years of shrinking. It's a big change. And the way that we think about infrastructure, the way we think about our city has to change alongside that. So that means looking at our very good public transport system. We are very lucky because we've got a very old, but therefore effective and existing skeleton of railway rapid transit networks. But we also have to look at the road network, which for us is sort of our Achilles heel. If you look at the map of London's road network, it's very ancient. It's medieval, sometimes before that. And it's not, the Parisian boulevards. It's not carefully planned. We don't have the motorways that, a lot of other cities have. So for us, that's a big issue when 80% of our trips happen on the road network.
80%. And give us a sense also of how it must be when you've got such old infrastructure, but already, as you say, helps it be to a certain extent. You've got the map already there. You've got some of the beating heart there already. How much are you having to also make sure that the city remains true to itself, that you keep the character while you're actually trying to improve it and make it that much more efficient?
Yeah, Boris and Mike talked about that earlier, didn't they? It's about how do you attract the best and brightest around the world, companies as well as individuals, to come and live in your city. So we're not the cheapest city, we're not the fastest growing city, we're not the lowest tax city. So for us, we want to compete on quality of life. We've got 2/3 of London is actually green or blue, so it's either parks, gardens, or rivers, lakes.
2/3?
So, yeah, 2/3 of the area of London is green or blue. Well, people forget the outer parts of London are, sort of fields and horses and all that kind of stuff. So we encompass quite a large area. So we need to preserve that character. People who want to have a sort of nice quality of life, relatively low density, that London will be appealing to people like that. So we need to continue to enhance that. The road network is one way we can do that, is by making our roads much more attractive, getting away from the 1970s style big gyratories, motorways outside people's homes, and moving away from that. But that's very painful. Boris talked earlier about the political pain of putting in cycling lanes, for example. Everybody's for it until you're doing it, and then everyone suddenly, decides they didn't like cycling so much after all, because they didn't realize they were going to have to wait an extra 6 minutes in the traffic queue.
So how much do you have to negotiate, to compromise? How difficult, how much of your daily life is political now in that extent to ensure that you're reminding people of the longer term goals and the longer term aspirations that you're achieving by having the cycle lanes?
I think that's the difficulty. I mean, the political environment can create the atmosphere for change, and a lot of what we do is to try and build on some demand for whatever it is, let's say better cycling infrastructure or better air quality, and we use that to create the political will to do some things that we know are not going to be popular. Usually what then happens is, in the political cycle, is that you satisfy the cyclists or you satisfy people who want cleaner air, because you've got great plans to tackle it. But once you're rolling those things out, as a lot of people here will know, then all of a sudden those people have gone away because they're happy, they're satisfied, they've got what they wanted. And then all of the opponents come out of the woodwork and say, hang on a second, I've got to buy a new vehicle, I've got to retrofit my car, I'm not going to be able to drive into the center of London without paying 3 times as much because I don't have the right cleanliness vehicle, or I'm stuck in longer queues in traffic terms, and your political allies are, long since gone because they're happy, and the opponents are right there, and you've got to be able to hold your nerve through that period. I think having a progressive urban policy, everyone here would agree with that, but the reality of actually implementing it on the ground, as some people will know who are here, is much more difficult.
And talk to us about some of the phenomenal projects that are going on. In terms of size, I mean, £4 billion being spent on modernisation programmes. What are some of the ways that you think perhaps you can be convincing more political allies to come on board? Because you're doing some really very forward-thinking elements to these projects.
Yeah, there's probably three areas. One is we are upgrading the tube, so it's 150 years old. So doing that is one of the most technically challenging things that you can do. But you can get a lot more capacity on the existing tube network, and so that's a big opportunity. But we're also building Crossrail, which is a huge tunnel through the center of London, and they've discovered, skeletons from the Black Plague and, all sorts of things that we didn't know were down there. So it's an amazing technical feat to do that, but that'll significantly increase rail capacity in the peak times. But we are also extending lines, so the Bakerloo line, which goes into South London, we are looking to extend that to the south. But in general, we're facing a time where there aren't big public handouts of money, and that's the case in a lot of other cities. So we used to get significant levels of grant funding from central government. That's no longer the case. So if you want to extend a tube line, instead of saying, please, can we have £1 billion or £3 billion, depending on how much it's going to cost, we actually have to look at development as the source of how we're going to pay for these pieces of infrastructure. So what we do is we're actually now looking, we actually will align transport infrastructure based on where we can get development changes, regeneration, housing. So in the case of the Bakerloo line extension, you could take it almost anywhere, and we're looking to capture as much of the increase in land value, and that's what we're going to use to pay for that piece of infrastructure. It's a problem for cities around the world. There isn't money floating around out there that can just be handed over as cash. So how do we capture the big increases in land value that transport infrastructure generates and use that to pay for the transport infrastructure upfront? So we're not alone in facing that challenge. So there's a whole number of areas around London where we're doing that at the moment, which is also, of course, delivering homes. So the number one issue in London is we're not building housing at the rate that we need to. We're several tens of thousands of homes a year slower than we need to be in building homes. So we're doing a lot to catch up. But interestingly, transport can actually deliver that because it can unlock these housing sites.
There must be quite a chicken and the egg situation there, that how much are you making the property play first? Are you thinking, I know that Stratford could be that much larger, Whitechapel could be born much more and funded, so could Acton, or is it that these areas lobby you? At what stage do you have that decision?
Yeah, you have to be opportunistic about it. And actually, we used to talk about a lot of these projects as transport projects. But because transport's improved a lot over the last 10 years in London, people now complain primarily about housing. That's the number one political issue in London. So we've sort of transformed a lot of these projects to describe them as housing projects. The project itself hasn't necessarily changed, but we would talk about it as a housing project. So you have to be a bit fleet-footed in thinking about what are the political buttons that this project's going to press. So at the moment, we're leading on these projects as housing projects primarily. Then, if that changes, then we might change the political narrative. And you absolutely have to go where the political opportunity is locally. London has Boris and the Mayoralty has substantial powers, but we have 33 boroughs. They have a lot of the local powers and the planning powers. So, for example, we're doing some work with Barking and Dagenham out in East London, looking to put the A13, which is our big motorway coming in from the east, underground, to put the whole road underground and build housing on the surface. So it's not actually a transport project because it's not going to create more transport capacity, but it is going to transform the area, get rid of the severance that road is creating, and then you just, basically put it underground, turn it into a linear park, build tens of thousands of homes. Politically, that's much more appealing than talking about congestion.
And that must also help to a certain extent air pollution as well. What are some areas that you're having to focus on? What political elements are there as well? Because much of us are going to find potentially in the short term our commute more important than the air that we're breathing, but really in the longer term it should be the
Air pollution is a fascinating topic because everybody should get a lot more exercised about it than they do, because it does have very obvious and immediate health impacts. So we did a study showing that 4,500 people a year in London are dying prematurely because of air pollution. Actually, that number is now probably about 3 times higher than that because of other other materials that we hadn't previously taken into account. So it is a huge health issue. But the same people who will say, oh, it's unacceptable that little Bobby has asthma, will get in their big SUV and drive their child to school in a highly polluting vehicle. So people don't connect their own behaviors with the experience of pollution out on the street. We've done a lot on air pollution, thanks in part to a very powerful lobby in London around air pollution. So London's much cleaner than a lot of other cities, but because we've got a lot of political pressure on it, we're able to do a lot more. So Boris talked about the ultra-low emission zone, which will be in central London, which has a very high standard for entry into the zone. We've got a London-wide low emission zone, which now covers pretty much any vehicle type except for cars. And these kinds of things are extremely difficult to bring in politically, because again, everyone can sign up to the outcome, but it actually means people need to spend £2,000 retrofitting their vehicle, or £5,000, £10,000 buying a new vehicle. And we've had, thousands of letters into City Hall from, van drivers who say, I've got to remortgage my house and my wife is divorcing me because you've brought in these pollution restrictions. And as a politician, those are very difficult. One is fine. Hundreds of letters like that becomes very, very challenging. So it's one of those topics that is going to be an issue for cities around the world, but the politics of it are extremely difficult because of the cost associated with retrofitting all of these vehicles. And there's been the VW scandal recently. The Euro standards that we have in Europe that were supposed to drive all of this haven't worked. So cities are in the unfortunate position of having to put in place policy measures that arguably the industry should have sorted out long ago.
There's a carrot and a stick element, I'm sure, to when you are navigating these political waters. You then have the carrot of actually it can do economic boosts, economic sense to a city doing this. I mean, for example, the black cab company, now being much more emissions friendly, but that's creating jobs at the moment because the Chinese company has come in and is helping provide that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, the UK automotive industry is one of the most technologically advanced and one of the cleanest in the world, and they do a lot of really interesting, groundbreaking work on emissions. We have the biggest retrofitting industry in the world, so, traps that you can put on the back of your vehicle, partly because of the policies we have. The Chinese who own the London Taxi Company, which makes most of the black cabs, have just invested £300 million in Coventry to build the factory that's going to build these new clean taxis, and thereby kind of assuring that the people who build taxis will continue to have jobs up there and that continues to be vibrant economic activity. But I think we really struggle to tell that story sometimes, and the automotive industry, I think, have sort of been a bit, they've become very reticent because they're sort of seen as the bad guys, not as the agents of change. And potentially they could be positioning themselves as the agents of, cleaner air for everyone, and we're making your children healthier. And something that we've been trying to work with them to get them to come out of the shadows a bit more and actually embrace the fact that they can be a force for good. Because it's difficult to find allies in this sometimes. So, I think for them it's a fantastic opportunity. They could really be, pushing forward with that.
Talk to us about the agents of change that you perhaps could harness even better at the moment. We kicked off things with Boris Johnson and Michael Bloomberg discussing technology and discussing how wonderful the tech hubs are in Silicon Valley, indeed in New York, and indeed in London. But are they talking to you enough at the moment? Are the new young companies that are driving all this growth in Silicon Roundabout, as we call it here, coming up to you and saying, I can fix this for you? Are they realizing the challenges we have from a public point of view?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a series of buzzwords in any industry, and cities are no different, are they? So there's smart cities. Everybody who sits where I sit, most people I talk to say, no idea what smart cities means. And by now, we've all so sick of hearing it that if somebody says, can I come and talk to you about smart cities? It's like, no. And now technology and disruptive technologies are a bit in that vein too. Everyone knows they should be worried about it. Everybody's thinking about it. But what does that actually mean for us as city politicians, as city decision makers? And I think we have got a very long way to go still on that. I think we're all on the back foot. Somebody was reminding me the other day that iPhones didn't exist before 2007. So it has been changing very rapidly. Having said that, we need to radically step up how we take advantage of these kinds of technologies and also our communication. We tend to talk about technology with other non-technology companies, so we all get together at conferences and say, oh, disruptive technology is very interesting, but there aren't actually any representatives of any of these tech companies there. So that conversation isn't happening to the extent that it needs to, in my view. And the other thing that we're not using technology for, it's not just the operational stuff around, say, traffic management or demand management, it's also around social media and how we engage with the public about projects that we want support for.
Yeah.
So the cycling agenda in London is an example where we did get it right. So in 2011, there was huge political pressure about cycling. There were some very high-profile fatalities in cycling, and there was a huge uproar on Twitter and across sort of a series of blogging platforms about why weren't we doing more about this. And we ended up working very closely with a lot of the bloggers and the sort of influencers on Twitter to craft the program that we're now putting in place. We've got a £1 billion cycling program that before that we had very little that we were actually doing on the network.
Just and that's been remind people of the aggravation is worth it.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of actually developing that program, it was reaching around some of these big established bureaucracies, which are both the transport agency, but also big incumbent sort of NGOs, big incumbent lobbying groups, which weren't really very fleet-footed in the way that they communicated. So we ended up working very closely sort of with these new up-and-coming bloggers who actually turned out to be much more influential and have better ideas about what we should be doing out on the network. So that's a great example where that worked to create the program, and it worked to create the political will to deliver that program. But we don't do that in a lot of other areas where we could do that. Air pollution is a good example, or a big piece of infrastructure. I think cities and in general, big incumbent players have a long way to go in thinking about how they can use some of these technologies to stimulate an understanding of what it is we're trying to do, stimulate support for what it is we're trying to do. But because most of the people working in these sort of big established organizations don't use Twitter themselves, or they don't blog, they don't understand that whole world is just slightly alien to them. So then they use Twitter as a kind of broadcast mechanism, the way you'd put out a press release.
I mean, so obviously your term is coming to an end point, of course, as Boris leaves. What would you tell the next Isabel, the next deputy mayor of transport? Is it go talk to Waze, go talk to the Ubers, to the disruptors, the city mappers, get your data into their hands, help forge more partnerships? How could you make it that much more efficient, do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, if I look at for example, sort of a progressive roads policy, I think what we need to do is be much clearer about where we think we're going to get to in 5 or 10 years. So, for example, there's no reason now why we can't link up all the Oyster and contactless payment information on buses and tube with all the information about where taxis, minicabs, and cars are going. And we could link up your car data and your number plate data with your Oyster data so that we could actually price across the whole spectrum. You can get people to opt into that so that you can then manage demand across the whole spectrum. We don't really do that with price. We say, well, it costs you this much to take the tube, but we don't say, well, on Tuesdays it might cost you less, or if you buy 200 trips, you get 10% off. There's a whole range of clever pricing tools which, for example, mobile phone companies would use, or retailers, and we don't even think about that. So what I'm saying is if we had a sort of shared agenda of 5 to 6 years from now, we want to use price and technology platforms as a way of managing demand in the city, which means that we can then bring down the cost of providing transport infrastructure, because we're just building for the peaks all the time.
Yeah.
All of transport infrastructure is built for the morning and evening peak, and basically the morning peak, because the evening peak's flatter. So we could actually bring down the cost by many billions of pounds to build this infrastructure if we were managing people across the day much more intelligently. So if we had a shared agenda with the tech companies of where we're trying to get to, work backwards from that, I think it would make us much more intelligent as policymakers and investors, and would probably help the tech players to input in the right places so that they actually can see where it is that we're trying to get to.
You sound optimistic. In terms of the achievements for technology and indeed for efficiency and air pollution, we're going to help rectify the situation. Will there be fewer than the 13,000 deaths that you were talking about?
I always say, to me, it's obvious that at some point in time, every vehicle in central London will be zero emission. So the only political question is, how quickly is that going to happen? I don't think anybody thinks that won't happen. So it's just a question of, do we want that to happen 100 years from now, or do we want to be the people who have helped to bring that to 10 years from now? And similarly, progressive road policies that say to people, look, tube, bus, cycling, walking, we're here to enable all of that. There isn't going to be more traffic in central London in 20 years' time, 30 years' time. There will be radically less traffic in central London. And the sooner that we embrace those facts and then think about, okay, so what do we do to try and accelerate that time frame, because it's inevitable anyway, the easier all of our lives will be, because the idea that we're here to try and facilitate a big growth in private vehicular traffic in central London, for example, it's totally outdated. That isn't the way the world's going to be. So we shouldn't be trying to protect that world. It's not going to exist anymore.
I think we've found ourselves a very progressive Deputy Mayor of Transport. Thank you very much indeed, Isabel, for being on, for giving us some of the expertise that you have.
Thanks, Caroline.
Big round of applause.